What's up, everybody? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden, and in this episode, we're going to be finishing up The Divide, Chapter 9, Collateral Consequences. It's a slightly shorter chapter than usual, so this will probably be a slightly shorter episode than usual. I'm going to read to you 3 different parts of it, and it's really just Matt Taibbi tying things up and using tiny little examples of how the divide actually is in this country. And the divide is really, in Taibbi's words, kind of like an inverse correlation between how much money you have and how much, or a direct correlation between how much money you have and how much the police and the judicial system craps on you. So the richer you get, the less rules you're subject to. And when it comes to these really rich CEOs, Wall Streeters, hedge fund managers that have basically infinite money that they've gotten by cheating the system, have virtually there's no way to jail them. It's hard to even find them. So the system is built upon this sort of like schizophrenia, and there's 2 different worlds you can live in. A world where if you don't have a lot of money, the system can suck you up into prison or the judicial system and fine you and waste your time until you don't have any money at all. Keeps a lot of people that are of color downtrodden, deliberately so. Meanwhile, all these rich white dudes basically can get away with toppling financial markets, collapsing the world economy, and never see the inside of a jail cell. And sometimes they don't, or in most of the time, they never have to admit fault. And the system is designed that way. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about HSBC, a bank. The middle part of the chapter is actually comparing, like, if 2 banks do similar fraud, necessarily it's always the smaller bank that the government goes after, because it's too hard to get the bigger banks. And the system's designed that way, since our system basically immunizes the wealthiest people who own all of these institutions against even our own government interference or government investigation. They simply get away with everything because it's so much more financially feasible to even go after other banks or other smaller institutions. So it's rigged. It's rigged, guys. So let's start here. Patrick Jewell is the main character for the first part here. He's just a white musician who he was dropping off his girlfriend at her job. They were walking. One morning he dropped her off, and then he was walking home and he was rolling up a tobacco cigarette, and then 2 or 3 plainclothes police officers beat the shit out of him, took him in, and he ended up getting stuck in this hellhole for a couple of days, where he eventually got out because the plainclothes police officers that beat the shit out of him basically mistook his identity. And the reason that Taibbi tells his story is because the only reason it seems shocking that this happened to him is because he happens to be white. This stuff happens orders of magnitude more for people of color in this country, where you just fit a description and the cops will fucking take you down. So let's read about Patrick. I'm going to not read you the whole story, just what that story happens to explain for Taibbi here. This story reads like a shocker only because Patrick Jewell is white, a college-educated musician. Imagine the same story a few 100,000 times over, and you're starting to plug into the ordinary urban non-white experience. And that, too, is a collateral consequence that we've decided that we can live with. Patrick Jewell most likely was some plainclothes policeman's visual fleeting error, a rolled cigarette mistaken from a distance as a joint. But instead of simply walking up to him and asking him what he was smoking, the law enforcement's first move was to assault him, frame him, toss him in jail, and run him all the way through the system without apology rather than admit the mistake. And they did plant drugs on him when they found out that it wasn't weed that he was rolling up. Patrick's arrest was the essence of stop and frisk, which itself was the perfect symbol of the new stats-based approach to city policing. You throw a big net over a whole city region, bounce some heads off sidewalks, and throw back the little fish. Almost as important, and this aspect of it is little discussed, you gather intelligence with each catch. The thing is, this particular ocean, to push the metaphor a bit further, is getting overfished, so they're trawling more remote waters. The nets being cast are wider, which is a fancy way of saying it's not just blacks from Bed-Stuy or Hispanic workers in rural Georgia or Mexican single moms living out of vans who are getting the treatment. Being white and middle class never meant your kids breezed into Yale with C average. That kind of privilege was always reserved for a special kind of wealth. But it did once mean that police would think twice before bouncing your head off the sidewalk. But not anymore. And it's not just the streets. Financial regulators, too, are expanding their range of targets. Once HSBC and Barclays and UBS and Chase and Goldman Sachs and the rest of the Collateral Consequences all-stars secured their status as unprosecutable, too big to jail institutions, the margin of regulatory error suddenly became that much smaller for the giant subset of all other businesses. The SEC tells Congress it makes about 735 enforcement cases a year, and it needs to hit or surpass that number every year to expect its budget to keep flowing. But if the SEC has a powerful disinclination to make those cases against Lloyd Blankfeins and Jamie Dimons of the world, that's Goldman Sachs and Chase, it's going to start looking at everyone else's books far more closely. It's going after smaller businesses more aggressively than before. It's profiling, except it's expanding the profile, and on the flip side, it's doing the same thing only in reverse. Quote, I can tell you just from 40,000 feet that some of the most damaging behavior on Wall Street, some of the least ethical behavior on Wall Street, wasn't illegal. That's exactly why we had to change the laws. That was Barack Obama on December 11, 2011 on 60 Minutes. Like most things spoken out loud by lawyers of Barack Obama's caliber, the president's now infamous 60-minute statement was parsed to mean nothing at all if you examine it closely. Some of the least ethical behavior wasn't illegal. Okay, that's probably true. But did that mean some of it was illegal? Or alternatively, did it mean that all of it wasn't illegal? He didn't say it either way. From a factual standpoint, the statement was absolutely meaningless. But psychologically, it was meaningful. It showed us how they think up there in the upper reaches of this giant cultural bureaucracy. Obama was echoing the main mantra that continued to emanate from Wall Street after the crash, in which high-level executives involved in this or that scandal repeatedly insisted that what they had done was not actually against the law. The thing that's interesting about this claim isn't that it's factually wrong, which incidentally it almost always is, often to a humorously enormous degree. What's interesting is that the people who make this claim usually believe it to be true. Even Barack Obama, despite the fact that he's almost universally understood to be an outstanding lawyer and should know better, probably believes it to be true. This weird psychological kink is where the divide lives. Increasingly, the people who make decisions about justice and punishment in this country see a meaningful difference between crime and merely breaking the law. There's a community of maybe 10 or 20,000 lawyers and business people living mostly in New York and Washington who are being asked to evaluate the behavior of their peers. And out of sheer dumb sympathy and shared perspective, they just can't see certain behavior as criminal in the sense that the rest of America does think it's a crime. So, and that's crazy because that's absolutely true. And that's part of the reason why I always say that most of these politicians are sociopaths. I don't think they're disconnected to the extent where they really can't see what kind of harm they're causing. It's deliberate. They're rich elitist pricks. They benefit off of exploitation of other people, and they network with other people that have that same sort of sociopathy and apathy towards the poor. So it's a big club, and you ain't in it, as George Carlin used to say. And they keep this system the way that it is because they have all the power in this system. And so Barack Obama, what he's really saying there is like, oh, it's not a big deal that these Wall Streeters and dirty hedge fund managers collapsed world economies. What they did isn't technically illegal. How about we talk about what's moral? These people don't talk about what's moral. They talk about what's illegal because, they're all part of a big club. He's friends with a lot of these Wall Streeters. A lot of them give money to Barack Obama's campaign, but also Trump's campaign and Biden's campaign. It's a big club. So let's talk about now how the law is applied differently to, like, if it's just banks and one bank that's small does a certain type of fraud and another mega bank does that same thing, even on a huge scale, there's no incentive to go after the big bank. They just martyr the smaller bank. So the system is also set up within itself to go after the small fish because it's impossible to go after the big fish. The problem is, if the law is applied unequally enough for a long enough period of time, at some point law enforcement becomes politically illegitimate. Whole classes of arrests become, circle 1, illegal, improper, or morally unenforceable. We have to be really close to that point right now. Too many of the same damning themes keep jumping out. The first and most obvious is that two people caught committing the same crime rarely suffer the same punishments if they aren't the same kinds of people. There are enough examples in this book. Abacus versus every other bank in the world, or Tory Maroney in jail for a joint while HSBC executives walk for washing hundreds of millions for drug dealers. Some guy in backwoods Arkansas gets arrested for forging a check for $450 to bail his girlfriend out of jail, but nobody gets arrested for systematically forging thousands of signatures in foreclosure affidavits. That's Chase. One of the most amazing examples of arrest-no-arrest lunacy in recent times was witnessed by former SEC investigator and famed whistleblower Gary Aguirre. Aguirre joined the SEC in 2004, less than a year before the Arthur Andersen case would be overturned. Upon joining the agency as an attorney and investigator, he famously was assigned to look into a series of suspicious trades involving a company called Heller Financial, which had been acquired by General Electric in 2001. In a story that has since been extensively documented by Senate investigators, Aguirre found that the star trader of a hedge fund called Pequot Capital, Art Sandberg, had made a series of suspiciously prescient trades ahead of the Heller merger, pocketing about $18 million in a period of weeks by buying up Heller shares before the merger, among other things. But Sandberg had never had a meeting about Heller and appeared to never have spent 1 minute researching the stock. Quote, "It was as if Sandberg woke up one morning and God told him to start buying Heller shares," Aguirre says. Aguirre did some digging around and found that just before making those trades, Sandberg had been in contact with his old friend John Mack. Mack had recently stepped down as president of Morgan Stanley and had just flown to Switzerland, where he'd be interviewed for a top job at Credit Suisse First Boston, the company that happened to be an investment banker for Heller Financial. Now Mack had been on Sandberg's case to cut him in on a deal involving a spin-off of Lucent. Quote, "Mack is busting my chops," end quote, to let him in on the Lucent deal, Sandberg told a coworker. So when Mack returned from Switzerland, he called Sandberg. Sandberg suddenly decided to buy every Heller share in sight. Then he cut Mack into the Lucent deal, a favor that was worth $10 million to Mack. Dot connects to dot, a seemingly open and shut case. The SEC refused to investigate this highly suspicious-looking series of events, denying Aguirre the right to even talk to Mack about these trades. Again, this is well known and become the central focus of a widely covered Senate hearing later in the decade. Aguirre was eventually ruled to have been wrongfully terminated and won $755,000, a settlement from the SEC. What is less well known about the Aguirre case is that the SEC did actually pursue an insider trading case involving Heller Financial. It just wasn't against a powerful, well-defended figure like John Mack, who was represented at the time by former U.S. Attorney and future SEC Chief Mary Jo White, but instead against a, pair of schmucks. The two hard luck cases were mid-level GE executive and, wait for it, his kung fu instructor. The two had conspired to make a $157,000 trade ahead of the merger. You can look it up. It's called United States versus Anthony Christokos and Michael Martello, filed in 2002. These two idiots realized a total profit of $157,259. Christokos, the GE exec, ended up getting 15 months in jail for the crime. Sandberg, meanwhile, made $18 million on his Heller trade, and Mack made about $10 million through the seemingly linked Lucent deal. But Mack got off scot-free and was not even interviewed until right after the statute of limitation expired. Aguirre remembers being astonished to learn that the SEC had chased such a small fry when such a big target was sitting right there in front of them. Quote, "Two cases, the same stock, but they went after the little guy," he says. So like I said, that tells you, it's like, you can even be part of their club, but if you don't have as much money as the people that are ahead of you, they'll just, they'll sell you out. And that's, of course, why a lot of these little banks, they end up getting bought out or put out of business on purpose by these banks, or they end up being investigated by the government way more than the big banks are because there's simply not enough resources, they say, to go after the enormous institutions, effectively rendering these rich Wall Streeters completely impervious to our laws. And the flip side of that is that if you're poor, you're vulnerable to laws that don't even exist. You're vulnerable to police that can arrest you at the drop of a hat. So, like I said, there's a correlation between how much money you have and how the law applies to you, and that correlation is if you're poor, you're going to get the boot on your throat, and you're never going to be able to live your life, and you're basically going to be downtrodden your entire life. If you happen to be rich and you're exploiting people to get hyper rich, the richer you get, the less likely the law will actually be able to come after you, or if it even applies to you at all. So let's read to you the last part here. Here we go. It's talking about a woman who lied on her food stamps paperwork, and they found out that they gave her like a couple extra thousand, I think it was over 10,000, maybe 20,000 extra food stamp benefits for like a year. Found out that she lied on her paperwork because she had another job at minimum wage, and then they said that she owed them money. So we're talking about that right here. Nobody is saying, and her last name was Antonio, nobody is saying people like Antonio aren't guilty, or that there shouldn't be a punishment for deceiving the government and making taxpayers pay the medical bills for her and her husband's 3 kids, because that was also what they did. They were paying medical bills. But if her crime gets punished, or with money that they would save because they're on food stamps, someone else committing the same crime has to receive the same punishment, right? This stuff isn't brain surgery. But there just aren't cases of bankers or mortgage lenders doing jail time or lengthy community service stints for dumping bad loans into mortgage pools. Nobody from a bank or a ratings agency is losing his or her kids or housing because he or she sold or helped sell bad loans to, say, King County, Washington, or the Iowa Student Loan Liquidity Corporation. It just doesn't happen. The method for dealing with that kind of offender increasingly involves fines and non-criminal sanctions. Responsibility for the fraud redounds to the institution which takes the punishment. The only thing that changes is that as the economy stagnates more and more and the wealth divide gets bigger, it becomes less and less possible for law enforcement to imagine the jail or garbage option for the collateral consequences crowd, and more possible to imagine it for an ever-expanding population of everyone else. The significance of the new Holder era cases was only that they formalized an already evolving system of legal schizophrenia, a weird two faces of Eve approach to sentencing. Take the HSBC case. In the rest of America, stiff money laundering punishments are handed out to all sorts of people in the newspapers pretty much on a weekly basis. Very shortly after the HSBC fiasco, for instance, the federal government sentenced a Texas racetrack owner named Jose Trevino Morales, who had been busted for conspiracy to commit money laundering after he reportedly bought millions of dollars of racehorses from a Mexican drug cartel. Tried alongside 4 others, Trevino was held up by federal prosecutors as a menace to decent American society. Quote, the government was able to show how the corrupting influence of drug cartels has extended into the U.S., with cartel bosses using an otherwise legitimate domestic industry to launder proceeds from the drug trafficking and other crimes. The local U.S. attorney Robert Pittman said, they hang themselves by their actions, added federal prosecutor Douglas Gardner. The total amount of money reportedly laundered in his case was somewhere in the area of $16 million. HSBC admitted to laundering more than $800 million. Trevino laundered it for the Zetas, HSBC for their rivals, the Sinaloa cartel. Trevino could get 20 years. At HSBC, nobody got a single day. These are enormous discrepancies. There's a huge difference between 20 years and nothing. That is, a banker slapped with fines he doesn't even personally pay, so what justifies the difference? Is there any conceivable reasonable explanation? I've heard the counter-argument firsthand. For instance, from the federal prosecutors who put together the settlements with companies like HSBC and UBS. In the course of the years I spent working on this book, I had numerous discussions with people from that side of the bar, usually on background. The people whose job it is to take on these big companies bristle at the notion that they're not working hard to lock up the bad guys. They, moreover, violently reject the idea that the fact that local cops all over the country are breaking heads and tossing people into jails and prisons for smoking joints and stealing socks and road flares, while their own white-collar targets get off with negotiated settlements, has anything to do with them. These are 2 completely different things, they say. They take it all very personally and make what at first blush sounds like very compelling arguments in their own defense. The arguments go something like this. We want to lock up the bad guys. If we could, we would. The problem is, it's very hard to gather evidence against single individuals in these massive corporate cases. Quote, what you don't understand, I was told pointedly by one prosecutor, is that you can't just throw these guys in jail just because you know they did it. You need witnesses. You need evidence. And getting such evidence is definitely not easy in these huge commercial schemes, where oftentimes it's not even clear where the offense took place, who had guilty knowledge, and who was just following orders, who thought their activities were sanctified by legal opinion, and who didn't, and so on. As a corollary, these people often ask about the public utility of throwing a few mid-level peons from a bank like HSBC in jail versus collecting $1.9 billion actual dollars. What's better, they ask, for the state? What's better for the people? With some regulatory agencies like the SEC, the settlements they collect go directly to victims. Within the walls of those agencies, the calculus starts to feel exactly like the math employed by any private civil law firm, where you're weighing the possibility of getting nothing at all versus the chance today at $100 or $200 million. So given these factors, prosecutors will tell you that these massive financial settlements and the binding deferred prosecution agreements that theoretically give the government enormous leverage over these offender firms are not only good deals, they're great deals. This sounds like a good argument. It really does. Trapped in a room with a federal prosecutor who argues for a living, you would probably find yourself buying it, but it's bullshit. It's belied by the entire history of these settlements. Since the mid-2000s, and especially since '08, we've seen one settlement after another with the same characteristics. Very high fines, limited or no admission of responsibility, and no criminal charges against any individuals. It's an incredibly long list. Take just one company, Bank of America, which paid out some $29 billion in settlements between '09 and 2012. There was the $150 million settlement it paid to the SEC for lying to shareholders about Merrill Lynch acquisition. There was a $600 million settlement for concealing a lack of underwriting standards in the loans put in pools mostly sold, as usual, to the defenseless elderly. There was $3 billion settlement for defrauding Fannie and Freddie. There was $410 million paid for charging phony overdraft fees, $20 million paid to the DOJ for illegally foreclosing on actively serving members of the military, $12 billion paid out in a foreclosure settlement, $2 billion paid out to Assured Guarantee for coaxing the insurer to wrap toxic bonds, and the list goes on, and that's just Bank of America. You could make up similarly long lists for Chase, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, HSBC, UBS, Deutsche Bank, Barclays, many others. All of these firms have paid upwards of $1 billion in settlements, if not more, since '08. Again, for Chase, the number is more than $16 billion, or 12% of its net revenue from '09 to 2012, and an even greater percentage of its net went to cover a $13 billion settlement in 2013. And in all, but very few cases, the narrative is exactly the same. There is somehow just enough evidence to extract hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in penalties, but somehow not quite enough evidence to force any individual to do so much as one day in jail. Every single time, the state lands itself right in that oddly enormous sweet spot between spectacular leverage to extract fines and no leverage at all to hand down any criminal penalties. This makes the quote-unquote not enough evidence defense either a total lie or the most unbelievable coincidence in history. In one case, maybe, but across all these diverse settlements and so many different types of cases, there's not one case against an individual. Then there's the damning question of resources. How many bodies has the state even assigned to gather evidence for these difficult cases? How much money has it been willing to spend for that kind of justice? It never put together a task force to concentrate on this corruption, never had a coordinated strategy. In fact, it barely even studied the problem. Fun fact, when the economy crashed in '08, the federal government formed an investigatory group to look into the causes of it. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Committee was given a budget of $9.8 million. Committee Chairman Phil Angelides acidly noted that this was, quote, roughly 1/7 of the budget of Oliver Stone's Wall Street Money Never Sleeps film. Meanwhile, that same year, the federal drug enforcement budget leapt from $13.3 billion to $15.3 billion. That meant that just the increase of the National Drug Enforcement budget for the year of the biggest financial crisis since the Depression was roughly 200 times the size of the budget for the sole executive branch effort at formally investigating the causes of financial corruption. This is an important distinction, that in this period of extreme crisis, we not only don't allocate funds to investigate crashes, we actively did increase the budget to tackle street crime, incidentally, at a time of declining street violence. If you press prosecutors, sooner or later they'll forget about the evidence and resources, questions, and come back to the social utility argument. What is better for society, they ask, sending a few HSBC bankers to jail or snagging $1.9 billion in fines from the bank? Why go after intangible rewards like political optics when you can have, bird in hand style, $2 billion right now without even risking the possibility of losing? That's an argument one can have. It might even have, who knows, some merit. But to even have that argument, one has to admit what it concedes. And what it concedes is that there's a concrete difference between how we treat an individual who commits fraud within the structure of a giant multinational company with a lot of settlement money lying around, and how we treat, say, an ordinary broke person who commits welfare or unemployment fraud. And I'll cut it off there. There's only a couple more pages after that. He just kind of summarizes everything, kind of how he did there. But you get the idea, guys. If you're poor, you have no representation. The cops can get you for basically anything, and once they've caught you in that net, sucked you into our judicial system, even if you're innocent, it'll take you months to get out, waste tons of your time along the way, and probably cost you a whole lot of money. And it's impossible for a lot of these poor people to actually defend themselves because they have full-time jobs. They don't have the money to defend themselves. You know, things like cash bail, unbelievably unethical and certainly racist, because most people, as Tulsi Gabbard said in one of the debates, it affects colored people in the worst kind of way because they're the ones that primarily end up getting put in jail because they can't pay bail. You know, got to get rid of that stuff. The prison industrial complex is a system that is set up to go out and catch people like this and try to get them involved in their basically indentured servitude system. As Kamala Harris once said when she was pressed on why she wouldn't get rid of the, she was California DA at the time, why they wouldn't get rid of their prison industrial system that they have in California, she said that would mess up their prison labor source. So she's literally a woman of color who's absolutely for indentured servitude, which is just slavery. She's a woman of color who's in favor of slavery. And why? Because all of the oligarchs want to keep their knee on the poor's throats. And this is a way to control them. And then as you work yourself up the ladder and you become one of that club, which almost no one ever does unless they're born into it. You have to be born into a ton of money. That club is immune from the law. Wall Streeters can commit the most ridiculous fraud, do zero paperwork, just do the stuff that they did in Wolf of Wall Street. They can go bang hookers and do crack off of tables or coke off of tables and do a whole bunch of drugs at work and never get busted. They just make money hand over fist, and because they have too much resources at their disposal to warrant them actually going to jail, they never do. So I would argue it doesn't matter what kind of money you can get from them now. You need to martyr some of these people and start putting them in jail so that you can nip in the bud any future people who want to do this. Otherwise, it's just a vicious cycle of them making off with all the money, us giving them tiny little fines, and then calling that a victory, which it's not. No, do what some of these other countries did, which is after the financial crisis, you just jail all the bankers. I forget what country it was. I think it might have been Portugal, but don't quote me there. But numerous of these countries, they might be maybe Iceland, I don't remember. But they actually do jail the bankers, and then you know what happens? If you martyr them, it's less likely that a whole bunch of people are going to get the idea to perform that same kind of fraud in the future. Crazy, huh? So we need to fix the prison industrial complex here. There's numerous ways that we could do that, but that's not going to happen with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris at the helm. They are, Joe Biden wrote the crime bill, which is basically the architecture, the framework that allowed this to get out of control in terms of the prison industrial complex. Also in the militarization of our police force, Joe Biden was, he architected all of that. And like I said, Kamala Harris has done similar things. She's definitely on board for keeping all people in jail, particularly people of color. When she was Cali DA, she did plenty to prove that that's exactly what she's for. They don't call her Cop Mala for nothing, you know. So, and she's absolutely for using people that are in prison as slave labor. So it's not going to happen under Joe Biden. It's not going to happen under a Republican president either. I really don't know what we can do other than just like scare the living shit out of the Democratic Party until they do the right thing. And right now we're really not doing that. But I hope that was a good book for you guys. We will be reading Man's Search for Meaning next, and I will actually be reading that entirely out loud to you in about 4 different episodes. But I hope you enjoyed The Divide. I'm giving it 5 stars. It was a great read, and as you can see, Taibbi has a flair for adding some dramatics to stuff that would otherwise be kind of dry material. He makes jokes along the way, which I quite enjoyed. So good job, Matt Taibbi. I loved your book. That was The Divide by Matt Taibbi. Keep fighting the good fight out there, guys. I'll talk to you later.